This morning you are in for a real treat. We have an incredible speaker who'll be talking to us for half an hour, and then we'll be doing a good Q&A at the end of that, which will be largely driven by all of you. So I'm just going to give you a quick background on our speaker this morning, and then I'll talk to you about how this morning will work. It is my absolute pleasure to be introducing Parag Khanna. Now, Parag is a leading global strategy advisor, world traveler, best-selling author. He's the founder and managing partner of Future Map, which is a data and scenario-based strategic advisory firm. He is the author of a trilogy of books on the future of world order, which have been translated into more than 20 languages. In 2008, he was named one of Esquire's 75 most influential people of the 21st century and featured in Wired magazine's Smart List. So Parag's a specialist in explaining geopolitical shifts and increasing influence of smart cities. This morning, he's going to be giving us an insight into how megatrends are reshaping the established world order, providing an evolved and uncertain backdrop and context to our strategic and tactical decisions. He is an expert when it comes to what does the future look like, as best as anybody can imagine it, and how might we navigate it both from an anthropological perspective and from a commercial perspective. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please let's welcome Parag Khanna to the stage.
Okay, thank you.
Well done.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Jack. So this is the part where usually someone would begin by saying, we meet in a time of great uncertainty. That is so cliche. Because I actually think that there's real deep certainties that we can talk about. And in fact, when people say that uncertainty is the nature of the system, I would turn it on its head. I would say that the system is characterized, the global system, by certain fundamental megatrends that are so robust that they have withstood every obstacle, every conflict, every financial crisis, every plague in history. And first and foremost of those megatrends is connectivity itself. And I think that's an important way to start today. It's an important way to begin the conversations that you're having over the course of this week, because as an organization, Swift, Sibos, the network, all of you are the enablers of that connectivity. You are the ones that actually make it happen. You're part of the reason why I am so confident that we should begin this conversation with the notion of connectivity and understanding and explaining what it is. So let me take a step back in time here with you, let's say roughly 75,000 years, to around the time that mankind began wandering around the world, populating the different continents. And over those 75,000 years, here's a map of every single road and railway that we have built, right? Stretching, connecting just about all the world's population. Now, let's layer in all of our energy systems, right? We've done transportation, now energy. Here's all of the world's oil and gas pipelines and electricity grids. And now, here are the fiber optic internet cables, right? The communications networks. And of course, this is an infrastructural matrix wrapping itself around the world, accelerating in its volume across the planet, across all continents, connecting all of human civilization together. And by some estimates, according to, for example, the engineering company Autodesk in San Francisco, we will build more such infrastructure in the next 40 years than we have in the past 4,000 years. And I think that makes perfect sense, because the world population has tripled since the end of World War II. And most countries, up until very recently, had not built sufficient infrastructure to cope with their growing populations, to connect their citizens to supply chains, to markets, to the world economy, to their neighbors. And that is the process that is now underway. Now, connectivity does not mean a world that is peaceful, that is stable, that is harmonious, that is equal. It is just as much a world of competition and conflict as it always has been. But the battlefield changes. The ground over which we compete changes. The technologies, the resources change. And I want to show you three aspects of this competition over connectivity: geopolitical, economic, technological, which themselves also overlap. But again, it changes the nature of the game, the rules of the game. So here what I've done is to list, since the end of the Cold War, over the last nearly 30 years now, experts have predicted 9 major conflicts, about 9, right, between China and Taiwan, China and Japan, with Iran, Russia, US and China, South China Sea, North and South Korea, China and India, India and Pakistan. Most of these are actually in Asia, right, in our general longitude from where we are right now. Now, why is it that for 25, 30 years, experts have been predicting this World War III? Any one of these conflicts could escalate, and there are some that aren't even listed here. And yet, we haven't had World War III yet. And part of the reason, and I think a very important part of the reason, is that increasingly antagonists are connected to each other. Now, if you think about the Cold War, which I think we can all remember, the United States and the Soviet Union didn't exactly have intense trade relations with each other. But today, of course, the US and China count each other as among their largest trading partners. And that dynamic is similar in many of these situations here. So instead of just thinking strictly about territorial conquest, right? I get a mile, you lose a mile, right? There's other factors at play in decision makers' calculations that involve cost-benefit analysis, to cutting off connectivity, to engaging in conflict over territory, over national pride, over whatever historical gripes they have between them, versus saying, we could have that war, but we could also have that pipeline. We could also have a trade relationship with that country. We could also move into their markets, right? And if we don't, others will. So there's a cost to that. And that is a very important part of the reason why, if you look at every single one of these instances, if you look at military escalation between India and Pakistan, if you look at physical military tensions between China and Japan, in fact, that is exactly what has happened. Leaders have said, wait a minute, I'm getting a call from a CEO here that says, we've got a lot of supply chain operations over in that country. I think you need to dial this down a little bit. Right? And that's what's happening. So yes, we still have geopolitical conflict. We still have international tensions. We have border disputes. But right now, as we sit here, there is not one major international military conflict underway where you would say that's going to escalate into World War III, despite all of those predictions. And you cannot explain why that has not happened. It's not because we're brilliant. It's not because we're lucky. Right? It's actually because connectivity plays a greater role in the day-to-day decision-making of leaders, the government, and in the corporate sector. Now, we also compete, though, over this connectivity, over those infrastructures, for example. You know, the Russia-Ukraine dispute is very much about the pipelines that connect the two countries, not just about territory. And the tensions in the world today are obviously also economic in nature, right? The way I see it, since we're not fighting that many wars over territory anymore, and part of the reason for that is also because we have created a lot of new countries, right? There are almost 200 countries in the world. There were only 51 when the United Nations was created 73 years ago, right? So the more borders you settle, the less borders there are necessarily to fight over. But what we do fight over is that connectivity. Right? And the more the world becomes an integrated marketplace, we compete over supply chains, over value chains. There's a famous expression in geopolitics: who rules the heartland rules the world. And the heartland is the term for the territorial region of Eastern Russia, Siberia, Central Asia, a very strategic domain. The way I see it, when you become a global marketplace, globally connected through infrastructures and supply chains, we are battling every single day, not over territory, but every single day there's a trade war going on. People talk about the trade war now as if it's something new. In many ways, it's not, because the elements of it, attempting to draw value chains, supply chains, production through industrial policy to one's own shores, that has been going on for a long time, for decades actually. So this is why I rephrase it: who rules the supply chain rules the world. And what we're engaged in is not a war, but a tug of war, a constant tug of war over the binds that connect us. And that was the image on the previous slide, by the way. It was an image from the first Olympic Games where tug of war was actually a sport. For about 3 or 4 successive Olympic Games, tug of war was actually an international competition. It's actually the world's oldest, it's mankind's oldest organized activity, sporting activity, is tug of war. There are cave drawings going back 10, 15,000 years showing armies using tug of war to build their strength. So to me, it's a very apt metaphor for today because we're fighting, but we're connected. We're fighting over that very thing that connects us. Now, I bring up now the economic dimension after the geopolitical, and that is this Venn diagram shows you the countries that have been involved in the TPP negotiations, which the United States was the architect of designing, but then pulled out of with the Trump administration, and the RCEP negotiations, which has been a much slower to progress constellation of mostly Asian countries trying to create a regional comprehensive economic partnership. Now, what surprised people in the White House when the Trump administration pulled out of TPP was it thought that the deal would collapse. But instead, all of the other countries, you can see here where Canada, Chile, Mexico, Peru are, raced forward to join TPP anyway, right? They saw the opportunity to expand trade, connectivity across the Pacific Ocean. Every single Western hemispheric country, almost except for Mexico and Canada, now have more trade with Asia, particularly with China, than they do with the United States. And that's across the Pacific Ocean. The largest geographical, physical barrier we have to connectivity among human populations is the Pacific Ocean. And already, such is the extent of trade relationships and supply chain connectivity and seamless logistics that Western Hemisphere countries, South America, Brazil, have more trade with China and Asia than they do with the United States. So immediately they said, no, we're going to join TPP. And Asian countries said, well, if the US is not going to be part of TPP, we'll still do it, and we'll also accelerate our negotiations towards the regional comprehensive economic partnership. So in other words, countries are realizing, and it's the countries in the middle colored green, including Australia here, that say to themselves, wait a minute, it's always better to be trading in multiple directions, not to pick one trade alliance or system over another. The winners are those who are connected everywhere, connected in all directions, benefiting from whatever opportunities present themselves, and hedging against the risk that some countries are going to pull out of one agreement, but that's okay, we're part of another. So there's a fungibility to trade relationships that individual players may not appreciate. They're not appreciating the system as a whole, in which everyone is getting connected to everyone else and can make their sovereign decisions about who they're going to trade with. So that was a bad miscalculation for sure on the part of the White House, and it's playing itself out in many ways. So for example, by not appreciating factors such as this, they said that they'll launch this trade war against China, but in fact, the United States is the third most important trading partner of China if you think about the world in terms of these regional systems. Economics, which I think you all understand, is not actually about countries and borders per se, right? It's about land, labor, capital, factors of production, supply chains. These things transcend borders. The nation, the country, is not the most fundamental economic unit. It never has been. And so what they fail to understand is that China's largest trading partner is Asia. It's other Asians by multiples. And its second largest trading partner, which I'll show you in a minute, is Europe. And then comes the US. So it's actually number 3 launching a war against number 1 to some degree from the perspective of China. Bad miscalculation. Let's continue on the intersection of how connectivity shapes competition in economics and migrate into the technology sphere. Like I said, it's a tug of war over global value chains. It's been going on for a long time. The strategy that almost every country has today, we most associate it with China, but it's not just China, is an industrial policy premised on increasing the complexity and the value added of their domestic economies, right? And that's captured here in this map. This is called the Complexity Outlook Index, produced by the Harvard Kennedy School. It ranks countries by the gap, if you will, or the extent to which by having more intense trade with some of their largest trading partners in high-tech areas, they can move up the value chain. So China has seen itself as being colored red here, meaning it could gain a lot more from intensified trade in technology with its existing largest partners to move up the value chain and ultimately displace them. And that's very much what it has been doing, of course, since for exactly 40 years, really. Shenzhen was established as China's first special economic zone almost 40 years ago next year. And since that time, China has required that countries invest in joint ventures, transfer technology, train its workers, and help, in a way, the national champions develop. And what we're seeing today in terms of being able to compete with and displace the incumbents and the foreign investors, that is 40 years of work. Like I say, we've been involved in trade wars and tensions and this tug of war for decades, not just since the Trump administration, right? This is all of human history. Empires and superpowers become what they are as a result of import substitution and industrial policy. This is how America became a superpower in the early 19th century and through the 19th century, through practicing import substitution industrial policy. This is what every empire in history has done. And China is no different. Like I said, certainties. It's an absolute certainty that this is what countries will do. And it's not just China. India is doing it now. India is saying, wait a minute, China has done it, we can do it too. If you want to sell in India, you better make it in India. Do you remember when Tim Cook of Apple went to India a couple of years ago, and his main goal was to get an Apple retail store opened in the Indian market, right? Want to sell iPhones directly in India. And Prime Minister Modi said, nope, not unless you procure 30% of the components from Indian suppliers, right? So Tim Cook walked away empty-handed, right? And that's what we consider to be a more open political economy, after all, right? And a democratic society. The fact is that the top priority for governments today is to acquire technology, to employ their workers, to move up the value chain, to be more innovative, and that's something that every country is going to do. They may do it because they've visited Silicon Valley or because they've visited Shenzhen. But either way, they're going to arrive at that conclusion, and that's why they're practicing what we often call a net benefit calculus, right? What is the benefit to entering into a trade agreement, an investment agreement with certain countries? What's it going to do for us? It's very different from the 1970s model, right? We assume that, well, globalization is all about chasing the lowest wages. We keep all the IP, they do all the low-wage stuff. Very, very simple, right? Tug of war doesn't look like that. And then there's more explicit, the cyber dimension of technology, right? There's two kinds, in my view, of geopolitics related to the internet. There's the geopolitics of the internet, which is, again, physical. The very first maps I showed you were really meant to emphasize that connectivity is not just an ethereal thing. You ask a kid, what does connectivity mean? And they hold up their mobile phone, right? And it's not connected to anything, so they don't appreciate the physical dimension of connectivity. And very often, when it comes to the internet, we don't appreciate it's a physical thing, right? But now, it's front and center in our news every day, right? There's a physical geopolitics of the internet. Where are the servers, right? Where are the cables? Where is the data stored, right? All of that has become a legal issue. Some talk about a great firewall of China, people talk about a splintering of the internet and so forth. And then there's the geopolitics in the internet, right? Equally profound, equally intense, playing out every minute of every day. I can't remember who it was, maybe James Comey, former FBI director, said there's only two kinds of companies, those that have been hacked and those who just don't know that they've been hacked, right? So we all know that this is playing out all the time. And of course, one of the strengths of Swift and of the network that you're part of is about focusing on that issue, right? How to enhance cybersecurity, how to enhance resilience of financial systems and transactions so that you can help to overcome the tension, if you will, in the geopolitics within the internet. It plays out also as tug of war. There is a tug of war over this asset class, right, of data, if you will. And not only of data, but the flows of data, right? Harnessing those transactions, profiting from being the agent of liquidity of those transactions. So you can see breaking it down between sort of Western entities and China. You've got the tension between Union Pay and Visa, Baidu's the satellite network and GPS, SIPs, the Chinese system, Swift, Alibaba, Amazon, Huawei, Cisco, right? In each category or vertical of technology or service provision, there is a tension going on. Now, a lot of people view this as a new Cold War, a division, an iron curtain, whatever the case may be. Eric Schmidt and others have said there'll be two internets, right, in the future. That I disagree with. And the reason is because the logic of the tug of war, right, the logic of gaining the maximum share, the logic of insinuating yourself into global markets means that what actually happens is that over time, Chinese players, Indian players, wherever they may originate from, as they seek to get a greater share of global markets and customers, they realize that they have to open their standards, right? They have to harmonize their technology with that of others. There has to be some convergence in order to be global. Otherwise, your market share will only be those in your domestic market, right? So I actually see over time what we see today as some kind of great bifurcation, and whether it's the internet or whether it's 5G telephony, ultimately, in order to be a global player, standards have to converge, and I think they will. Let me talk about another set of megatrends that fuels connectivity and that very much involves the size of your customer base in the future as institutions, as banks providing financial services to individuals and businesses, and that is urbanization. This is a heat map. A global demographic heat map. It shows the entire world's population. So every single one of us in this room is a pixel on this map. So as you can see, the locus of the world population is Asia. And what I've superimposed here are about 45 ovals. And these are the mega cities in the world today, projected out to the year 2030 by the World Bank, by the United Nations. These are going to be the places where the population size, rapid urbanization, infrastructure investment are all coming together into these archipelagos. Now, the reason I make maps like this is because when you go back to your office today, and I hope you'll appreciate the difference between those standard political maps you have hanging on your wall and these, because in your standard Rand McNally atlas or map, every city is just a little black dot. They're all the same size, right? Sydney is the same size as Beijing. Right? But in the real world, that's not actually true, is it? Cities are growing so large, they're actually fusing together into these mega clusters, if you will. And that's what I'm trying to depict here. Now here I've also removed national boundaries. You don't see the borders between countries, you really just see these urban clusters. And the reason for that is because, again, some of them stretch across international boundaries. 21 years ago, Hong Kong technically belonged to Britain, not to China. But in the last 20 years, what you've seen is that Beijing, since Hong Kong reverted to Chinese authority or sovereignty, has increasingly been fused together into this Pearl River Delta, Greater Bay Area, which is being zoned into one mega urban cluster. They've just opened up the world's longest bridge from Hong Kong over to Macau. There's rail networks and so forth, easier mobility for people across this region. It is, according to The Economist, now the largest population cluster, largest mega city cluster in the world. It's displaced Tokyo. There's about 60 million people living there. The GDP of that Greater Bay Area is nearing $2 trillion, which, to put it in perspective, is about the same as India's GDP. So imagine you're an astronaut flying around the Earth. You can't even see Hong Kong. You can't even say, oh, that's Hong Kong. That's the Greater Bay Area. But you can obviously see India. GDP is roughly equivalent. So what matters more, right? Cities or countries? And hence, when you're making your kind of corporate strategy map, right, you're looking at the future saying, where's my business going to be? Where do I need to have teams? Where do I need to expand offices? Where do I need to have a bigger presence? Where are the customers of the future? Where do I need to invest? Does a map of countries help you so much, or a map like this, where you can clearly see these are the 48 hubs of global, demographic, commercial activity? I'm missing some. As you can tell, raise your hand if you're Australian and you're very concerned that Australia is not lit up here. I knew that was coming, right? So look, here I'm showing you mega city clusters by demographics. So as you know, the entire population of Australia would fit in Greater Jakarta, which is why there's no one single Australian city that's circled here. That said, as you know, one of the motivations, since many of you are Australian, around developing this coastal connectivity through infrastructure, from Sydney through Melbourne, or Melbourne through Sydney all the way up the coast, is really around aggregating the resources and creating greater fluidity. across Australia's major cities, so that it can function as a whole greater than the sum of its parts. And that's what many of these cities are doing as well. But cities think differently, again, from countries. And this is, again, part of this new geopolitics of connectivity. It's very easy to look at a map of countries and say, of course, one country wants to conquer the other, it wants to be bigger. That's not exactly a brilliant insight. But today, countries, national policies are shaped ever more by what their leading cities want. And what their leading cities want is actually to be connected to other cities. There is literally a different psychology that a mayor and the business community and business leaders in cities have, banks and financial institutions, airlines, than what national leaders, defense ministries, prime ministers may have, right? They're very concerned about sovereignty and national security, and they should be. But cities are thinking, well, how can I connect to other cities, right? When Emirates Airlines, to take one that's sitting, the geographic heart of this map in Dubai, they're always looking for new cities to expand to connect to. Cities and their stock exchanges are always looking to merge with other exchanges and allow dual listings, seamless listings across jurisdictions, right? So cities think very, very differently, and cities want to create this network among cities. And I think that's a very positive trend. So let's bring the geopolitical layer, the territorial layer, the urbanization layer, the connectivity together, and you get the Belton Road. Because really what it is a project to link the cities, right, the population centers, the markets of this greater Asian region, all the way really Eurasian, all the way to Europe together. And that process has been actually going on since the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's been going on for literally 27 years to the day. On that day when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, China realized that it bordered more former Soviet republics of Central Asia than even Russia did. And of course, the energy-rich resources of the Caspian Sea, of the Persian Gulf, it realized it could now build infrastructure to access them. And so it began to do that. Now, you've all heard of Belton Road, right? Raise your hand if you haven't. Okay, well, some of you were thinking, raise your hand if you have. Okay, raise your hand if you have, just to give you some exercise. Good, better. Okay, so all of you have. Now, Belton Road is just a new name for something that's been going on literally for about 30 years, right? I've spent a lot of time over the last 20 years just traveling these Central Asian countries, going to Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, you name it, including Iran, Pakistan. And to make this map, I go to those countries, I went to them and I asked them, what are the infrastructures that you want to build? Tell me about the pipelines, the railways, electricity grids, the internet cables, all of those, transportation, trading networks, corridors that you need to build to connect to your neighbors, to expand your economies, to participate in global value chains. And these are the ones that they drew for me, in a way, and I put them all together. I have absolutely zero doubt that every single one of these lines that you see here on this map is going to be built, right? Today, you hear a lot in the media about backlash against Belton Road, contracts being canceled by Malaysia, Myanmar, Pakistan, and so forth. That's probably a good thing. It really helps a country's fiscal situation if it can get for $1.5 billion something it had originally agreed to pay $8 billion for. It's going to take that money and it's going to invest it in yet more infrastructure, right? All of these debt renegotiations are an excellent thing from the perspective of those countries, right? China doesn't really need the money. Fundamentally, though, every one of these countries, like I said, if you're thinking about the Indias and the Pakistans, the post-colonial countries, their populations, as I said, have tripled since the end of colonialism, right? In just the last couple of generations, with very little new infrastructure being built. They desperately need it. It's going to be built. It's going to be funded by China, by multilaterals. The World Bank is getting on board. China is now lobbying very hard for Japan to join the AIIB. The AIIB is probably the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which was created a couple of years ago. It's probably the fastest growing multilateral institution in world history, right? And this Belton Road is, without a doubt, the largest coordinated infrastructure investment program in world history. And it makes total sense. It's about supply and demand, the massive demand for infrastructure and the supply that is being provided now at a more or less affordable cost. You cannot put a price, really, because it's very hard to calculate the net benefit of infrastructure investment in all of its categories: transport, energy, communications, through urbanization, soft infrastructures like education, healthcare, right? All of those categories of investment have a major catalytic impact on economies. Very, very hard to actually put a number on it, right? But it is really the sine qua non of being part of the world economy and of modernization and development. And every country on this map needs it very, very badly. So there are risks. There is currency risk. We're seeing right now that certain currencies, as in South Asia and India, are certainly have been weakened as much as a result of international dynamics as their own domestic cycles. And then there's sovereign risks, as I mentioned, a certain degree of backlash. But the rewards that derive from infrastructure investment are manifold, and they are in the capital market arena. For investors looking at the categories of sovereign and corporate debt that are being issued more and more in local currency, which allows for greater stability in these markets. So there's been a big shift in the last 20 years from all new debt being denominated in US dollars towards there being a lot more market confidence in emerging market currencies. And of course, the need to grow, right? The need to expand into these markets, these consumer markets. Now, as I said, Asia is the locus of this demographically as well as economically. And Asia has, for far too long, been held as sort of synonymous with China. But if you depict through this cartogram, for example, the GDP of countries in Asia and worldwide by purchasing power parity, as one well should, because the domestic consumption share of GDP is rising in all of these economies. We make a mistake by believing that Asian economies are entirely trade and export dependent. For most Asian countries, export dependency is declining. And with our large populations, the domestic share of GDP is rising rapidly. So they're actually overcoming what many people think of as a trap of premature deindustrialization. So PPP matters a lot. You can see that Asia is, in a way, a multipolar area. And in fact, the swath of countries through South to Southeast Asia, Pakistan through India, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, and so forth, that's 2.5 billion people. That's 1 billion more people than China has, with on average demographics that are with a median age 5 to 10 years younger, and now growing at China's pace, in some cases faster. India is now growing faster than China. So if you take those 2.5 billion people of South and Southeast Asia and give them only half the growth rate that China has had in the last 30 years, which has been near 10%. But let's call it the democracy deficit, right? Sort of democratic societies are less decisive, won't grow as quickly as China has, even though, again, they already are. But let's just give them a 5% growth rate. They will equal China's current GDP in just 10 years, right? So we should not be ignoring the other 3.5 billion people of Asia, the 2.5 billion of South and Southeast Asia, while we only focus on China. Asia as a whole is a much bigger story than just China. And because of Belton Road, because of new trade agreements, because of the growing connectivity between Asian countries, and because of the trade war, which is incentivizing Asians to displace their dependence to the extent that they were dependent on trade with the US with trade with each other, that's actually been going on since the Asian financial crisis, you now have an acceleration of the complementarities between Asian economies. Here, you can see that every sub-region of Asia is trading more with every other sub-region, whether it's from the GCC, which is actually, some people call it the Middle East, most people call it the Middle East, I call it West Asia, because that's actually what it is. And West Asia trading more with East Asia, that's what we've called the energy super cycle for the last 20 years. And the complementarities they have in industry, in finance, in food, commodities, are all intensifying, right? And I include Russia within Asia. Russia's greatest trading partners are now China and other Asian countries, more so than Europe even. So I expect this to continue as a result of all of those factors I just mentioned. So the Asianization of Asia is really what we should be looking at, and that's obviously going to have big implications in financial services as well. Now, this has shifted the geopolitical and geoeconomic calculus for Europe, sitting right there in the middle. We've grown up in this transatlantic era, right, where the transatlantic trade relationship was the real anchor, the real center of world trade. But as you can see, Europe already trades more with Asia than it does with the United States. And that's why Europe's decisions about joining the Belton Road, when America urged it not to, right? And in a way, competing now to enhance exports to Asia, and especially to China, for every product category whose marginal cost has risen as a result of reciprocal tariffs imposed by China. You don't see, Europe shares America's concerns about IP protection and market access in China. But in the meantime, whether it's semiconductors or food, you name it, Europe is saying, if the cost of an American import is going to rise as a result of trade tensions, let us sell it to you, right? And that's why Europe is leaning more towards this Belton Road picture than towards the Atlantic. So, to me, connectivity is this, what I call the currency of power, right? You are powerful not based just on your size, but the extent to which you are connected to others and leveraging that connectivity. It is intensely geopolitical to build connectivity and to try and use that connectivity to enhance your position in global supply chains, right? Just being big doesn't mean you're important. Being connected is what makes you important. That's why China has been investing. It's made itself the largest trading partner of 124 countries. The United States is the largest trading partner of only about 56 countries, right? Now those numbers may change over time, but fundamentally all countries are realizing that connectivity is how you go about enhancing your influence. And that has a big impact on some of the intense sort of geopolitical questions of today. North Korea, Iran. The US is trying to isolate those countries. Europe, Russia, China is trying to engage with them, right? The forces of engagement and connectivity ultimately are going to win out. One party on the other side of the world is not going to be able to sanction and isolate a country or countries that sit in the heart of the ancient and future Silk Roads. One way or the other, whether it's in 5 years or 10 years, the Iranian market, which people consider to be the last great emerging market, 80 million, mostly young population, mostly urbanized, right? Its commodities are going to reach global markets. It's taken so much inward investment from China and other countries to build that new infrastructure. It will be connected. The same is happening with North Korea. As we speak, they're moving military forces away from the DMZ. Now, the two countries may or may not ever unify, but you can clearly see the infrastructure and the supply chain integration accelerating. And I think that's going to happen for all such countries. There's a risk, some people believe, of nearshoring, right, of retrenching. I call this the longitudinal scenario, right? And if you think about it, the United States has more autarky than any other major power in the world. Its trade dependency is less than 10% of its GDP, right? Far less than other countries. North America as a continent, the Western Hemisphere as a region, has all of the food, all of the fuel, all of the industry, technology, manpower it needs to survive and to sort of power itself without much dependence on the rest of the world. Europe actually has Africa as its third largest trading partner behind Asia and North America, and also is increasing its connectivity with Africa in a post-colonial way. And Asia, as I've just sketched out to you, is becoming a pan-region as well. So we could move into this scenario. I call this the live and let live scenario, right? Why do powers have to fight with each other on the other side of the world over what are really negligible geographies, when in a way they depend on each other less and less and have less reason to be political reason to be intervening in each other's affairs. There's good and there's bad sides to that, right? You could have less political conflict as a result, but you could also have more. And the reason is because this is a scenario where those supply chains and that connectivity that I mentioned at the beginning as being a barrier to conflict and escalation, because leaders say, wait a minute, we can't fight a war with them. We have all of our Walmart production is in China. All our iPhones are made in China. If everything is nearshored, well then it seems like there's less risk involved in conflict, less economic risk in conflict. And that may be something that Trump is aiming towards, right? Towards this nearshoring. I don't think it will work, because if you made every iPhone in Texas, right, how would you then compete in Asian markets to sell it? By putting it on a ship and sailing it for 20 days across the Pacific Ocean, and you expect that customers are going to wait for that phone to arrive, right? So because for most multinationals, their sales are greater outside their home countries than in them, right? They still need to be present in those markets. Even if technology allows you to make everything at home, it doesn't mean that economics makes it sensible to make everything at home. So I think we will continue to invest heavily in connectivity. Every country does so for its own selfish reasons. China is building Belton Road not to help to bridge this infrastructure gap and just to be generous. It's building it to avoid the Malacca trap, right? To avoid that red dot on the lower right side of your screen, the Straits of Malacca, through which most of China's goods imports and energy imports and goods exports flow, right? Up to 80%. And to build resilience for itself, it says we need to diversify our physical connectivity. We need this Belton Road, we need the Arctic, anything to avoid that one choke point. And traditionally in geopolitics, there's two other major choke points, or three others: the Straits of Hormuz, Suez Canal, Panama Canal. Right? Historically, we've thought in a world of just traditional goods and commodities trade, we worry that any disruption to connectivity in any of these choke points would be disastrous. Even just in recent memory, when Saddam invaded Kuwait, right, in 1990, oil prices spiked, right? Today, you can have tensions in Iraq and Ukraine with Iran, Libya, South China Sea, and oil prices, I mean, they've trended a little bit back upwards, but generally speaking, they're coming down as a result of supply diversification. The United States has come on stream as the largest oil and gas producer, and because of growing connectivity, fungibility of resources, global LNG markets, and so forth. So it's very hard to shut down, global energy distribution. Supply will meet demand. Prices will trend downwards. Investments in renewables also will do that. And so we've gone from this peak oil to gas glut, if you will. There's also, if you think about it, stability in the global financial system. Now, we worry about the cascading effects of a massive global indebtedness. We worry about a new financial crisis. But in terms of the liquidity being available now, not just in US dollar, but in other major reserve currencies, as well as the increasing bilateral lending networks and financial integration that is linking countries together, and cryptocurrencies and other instruments, the world is awash, if you will, in capital, even in a rising interest rate environment, to fuel this development and connectivity that gives each of us, that gives every country resilience. So if you're familiar with the work of Nassim Taleb, he coined the term Black Swan and wrote the book with that title. One of his most recent books is called Anti-Fragile. He says anti-fragile is something that's not just resilient. If you break it, it doesn't just grow back to what it was. It actually becomes better, it becomes stronger. And he has great examples of these anti-fragile systems in human history. Human evolution is one of them. Right? We've suffered great plagues and maladies, but we get taller and stronger over time. Right? The human physiology is an anti-fragile system. The same is true of the internet. Right? The internet is not just one system, not just one layer, it's many. And every year we're laying down more cables, having more servers. There's maybe 10 or so redundant layers to the internet. Even those who created it, no one military power can shut down the internet. And globalization itself, which rests on all of this connectivity that we're building, is also an anti-fragile system. I began going back 70,000 years, and I think we can safely predict well into the future. We continue to make all these investments in connectivity, again, for our own individual purposes, but collectively, all of that connectivity connects to the other connectivity, and it creates more pathways, more resilience, more anti-fragility. Because globalization fundamentally is about supply meeting demand. Right? And the more connectivity we have, the more it becomes possible for the supply of any good resource, reserve, idea, marginal currency increment to reach the demand. And I think that's where you come into this picture. You are agents of making the world more anti-fragile. Right? You are agents of making sure that the markets, the customers, the banks, the individuals who seek to be connected, who seek liquidity, are going to be able to access it. Right? You are part of that story of connectivity, of globalization, of anti-fragility. So even though connectivity is something that we fight over, it's intensely part of the geopolitics of the world today, in the end I come out relatively optimistic, because even though we are inadvertently making all of these investments, it does make the world a more stable system on the whole. So with that, thank you very much for having me here. I look forward to our conversation. Thank you. Thank you.
Well done, mate.
Thank you.
That was brilliant. That was brilliant. Did we enjoy that? Good. Now, guys, we are going to touch on one pertinent question before we go to the next session, which I really want to pose to Parag. It was also the most popular question that you guys voted. If the US pulling out of TPP is a big mistake, what do you make of Brexit?
Oh my God, biggest mistake since Hitler invading Russia? I don't know. Really, really dumb. I mean, I think the UK is, whether or not the buyer's remorse sufficiently kicks in to have another referendum or not, there's obviously, I would like to think, some growing appreciation that had they measured the value of connectivity, if you will, and done this cost-benefit analysis around connectivity to their largest market, and largest trading partner and so forth, they would probably have not made this decision. Again, the reason I map connectivity is so that we appreciate it. And Britain, is actually one of the top 5 most connected economies in the world, very trade dependent. So to do anything to rupture that connectivity is absolutely shooting yourself in the foot. So yeah, and it's up to them whether to turn around. The point I want to make though, because I don't have a dog in that fight, so I want to be absolutely brutally clear about something. Because if you go back a couple of years to after the referendum, people said, if Brexit happens, it's going to plunge the global economy into a tailspin, right? The lesson in connectivity, and this is effectively a mathematical principle, more or less, is that if you cut yourself off, you suffer. The system doesn't suffer. The world economy continues to grow, right? It's a self-inflicted wound. I want everyone to understand that because it applies to what the US is doing with trade as well. Because you cut yourself off, you lose. It's your exporters, it's your companies that wind up being the losers. The system will carry on without you. Globalization is bigger than any country and any power.
Parag, I think I speak on behalf of the audience when I say that discussion was insightful, confronting, and exciting.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you,
Parag Khanna, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.